With it becoming more clear that Germany was going to hold early elections for its federal parliament in February of 2025, the various parties in German politics decided their picks for who is going to be their chancellor candidate, meaning the person that, if the party wins, the position of the chancellor would take that office. Now, the SPD, the Greens, the CDU, CSU, and the AFD all have candidates, and whether or not the party has a good chance of winning the chancellor, they all put forward a declared candidate for the public that takes part in debates, that's a major player in the campaign, and that person is kind of who they expect to be the chancellor, assuming that party wins that position. And there was a long kind of heated debate and contention within the SPD over who the chancellor candidate would be. Now, Olaf Scholz is, of course, the incumbent chancellor of Germany from the SPD. He's been there since 2021. And despite him being the sitting chancellor, in most cases it would be expected that the SPD would continue with him going into his second term. However, both Scholz and his government are very unpopular. Scholz's personal approval rating is very low, and the approval or the support for the SPD, the Greens, and the FDP, all the parties involved in the incumbent government, have dropped significantly since when they took office. And so there has been a lot of discussion, somewhat in the SPD, but also amongst the mainstream media, over the possibility of Boris Pistorius, the defense minister, being the party's chancellor candidate. And the reason is that Boris Pistorius, the incumbent defense minister, is one of the most widely popular politicians in Germany right now. He has a much higher job approval rating than Olaf Scholz himself and also Friedrich Merz. So a lot of the hypothetical opinion polling has shown that if Boris Pistorius were to be the chancellor candidate for the SPD would do significantly better than if they had ran with Scholz, and potentially even beating the CDU-CSU in the elections in February. But the significant development came over the past several days when Boris Pistorius announced that he would not seek the position of chancellorship or the candidate for chancellor within the SPD. With this decision, it pretty much guarantees that Olaf Scholz will be the candidate for the SPD, and we already know that Friedrich Merz will be the candidate of the CDU-CSU, and so this means there's not going to be much major change in the election from now on. There will be some shift in the polls probably, but Boris Pistorius becoming the chancellor, at least according to the polls, would have been a drastic change in the dynamic of this election. So him announcing that he is not going to be running is a major development for the SPD. And some say, of course, that he wants to maybe run in 2029 later on, and he doesn't want to risk ruining his political career on an election where the SPD is very unfavorable to win. And so it is possible we could see Boris Pistorius run for for the leader of the SPD or for chancellor in the future. However, he has stated now that he wants to remain as the defense minister and support Olaf Scholz as the party's candidate for chancellor. Now, I want to take a look at the polling to see kind of how significant this was. If we take a look at the opinion polling, we can see that in the three-way race between Olaf Scholz, Friedrich Merz, and also Robert Habeck, which has recently been chosen as the Green Party's candidate for chancellor, in much of the polling, Olaf Scholz places third, and in pretty much all of it, he places second place behind Friedrich Merz. So Friedrich Merz, despite not being that popular, is significantly more popular than Olaf Scholz himself. And so what this shows is that the popularity of the SPD will not be positively affected by the chancellor candidate. Sometimes parties will nominate someone who's very popular in order to save them in the polls, in order to help them. And this kind of worked in 2021 when Olaf Scholz at the end became more popular than Armin Laschet, and that helped the SPD to narrowly cross over the finish line and beat the CDU-CSU in the election. And so this, of course, is not the case. Now, neither Merz or Scholz are widely popular, so pretty much the amount of support that the political parties get is what they're going to get in the federal election. The candidate factor is not going to play a major role in this election as it has done in the past, or how it could have done, according to some polls. Now, if we take a look at the polling with Pistorius and Merz, of course, this is hypothetical because Pistorius has not even announced he never even announced an intention to run. This was all done based off of the kind of media frenzy about him and the popularity he had amongst the public. And as we can see, it's a complete different picture. The Pistorius is significantly higher than Friedrich Merz, so we go from Olaf Scholz being significantly under Merz to Pistorius being widely ahead of him in popularity. Now, this would not guarantee that the SPD would win the election, but it would be a very positive factor helping the SPD, and they would likely get maybe 5 points higher and potentially overtake the CDU-CSU for first place, with Pistorius becoming the country's chancellor. So, of course, if we look at this polling, we can see that Pistorius not running is significant and will mean that the SPD's result, it's not going to mean that they're going to do worse than they were expected. It just means that the possibility of them maybe coming back and winning is pretty much out of the picture now. Of course, things could change. There could be scandals maybe with the CDU, but as of now, I would say the opinion polling we have is pretty much going to be reflective of the result in February. Of course, the Greens have Robert Habeck and the AFD has chosen Alice Weidel, but it's very unlikely that either of those parties are going to have a chance. The Greens have suffered major problems with defections and infighting in the party, and also the AFD doesn't really have any coalition partners. Even if they were to come second place, there's no really other parties that are going to work with them. So even if Habeck or Weidel do good or better than expected, or their parties do good, it's very unlikely that either of those two were to become chancellor. And I think at this point, with Scholz being the candidate for chancellor, it's almost certain that Friedrich Merz will become the next chancellor, and the CDU-CSU will rule Germany for at least the next 4 years. Now, I want to take a look at, of course, the opinion polling, and we can see that based on the results for the parties, it has been similar to what we have seen over the past several months, over pretty much the past year. The CDU-CSU is currently in the lead by a large margin of over 10 points with around 33%. And what's significant about this result, and this means they would recover all of the losses from 2021, and this would put them almost within like a tenth of a point of where they were in 2017, in 2017, the last election involving Chancellor Angela Merkel, and so this would recover some of their losses over the past 8 years, but it would not put them at the high position of the 40s that they were with Merkel in 2013, or in the like 1980s, 1990s era with Helmut Kohl. But for the standards we have today, this is a very good result for the CDU-CSU. Now the AFD is in second place with 18.4%. They have somewhat recovered from the scandals in the European election where they dropped around 14-15% in the polls, but they have not yet reached the 20% mark that they were at around in 2023. So the AFD is doing better. Of course, this is an increase around 8 points from the last federal election in 2021. So this will be a big victory for the party, a big milestone if they can pull off a second place victory, not only in the EU elections, but also in the national elections for the Bundestag. And even if they underperform, even if they don't come second place, them winning a huge increase like this is going to be seen as a victory for the AFD. This is going to be their best election result on the federal level if they're able to replicate this. But of course, like I said, the AFD pretty much has no chance of forming a coalition. The CDU and the BSV, the two parties that would be the only likely ones to work with the AFD, have both kind of ruled out and distanced themselves from doing that. And even if it were to, even if the parties were, there were to be some voice in the CDU, for example, to work with the AFD, the majority of the consensus of the party, and of course Friedrich Merz himself, is not to work. No cooperation with the AFD. So even a minority government is pretty much out of the question at this point. And then we look at third place, where you can see the SPD, the party of Olaf Scholz, is at 14.9%. And this is why there was a lot of people wondering if Pistorius would run, because with them being at 14.9%, they are pretty much dead on arrival. There is nothing the SPD can do. I mean, with this result, anything close to this result, Scholz will not be chancellor. The SPD will not be a major player. I mean, they will lose around 10 points of support. They will be in third place. This will be a disastrous result for the SPD on a federal level. This will be the worst result in the country's history of, since the Federal Republic. And this will be a humiliating disaster. If the SPD falls below 15% for the Bundestag election, that will be a defeat for the SPD that they will, have to recover with, over the next, and deal with over the next several years. And it's arguable that they might not be able to recover from it. The one thing that is interesting is that the Greens are now suffering a lot more than they were in 2023. Now, when I first started this channel, the SPD and the FDP were suffering significantly. However, the Greens were actually kind of steady, almost at or even higher than what they got in the 2021 election. That has clearly changed, and the Greens are now starting to lose support. And so we see that both the SPD and the Greens and the FDP are all dropping significantly from what they got in the last election. The BSV is at around 6%. It's not certain that the BSV will enter into the Bundestag again. Now, most polls have put them above 5% by a few points. They got 6% in the EU elections, and so I would say it's very likely, but it's not certain. And it is possible the BSV could fall below 5%. And we also see that both the FDP and Die Linke are below the 5% threshold. The FDP, they do have the chance to recover now that, Christian Lindner and the party has left the government technically. They could be seen, there could be an increase in popularity because of that, because they left the government. They could be seen as maybe victims. It's not certain that they gain over 5%, just like it's not certain for the BSV. However, as of now, I would say there's a more than 50% chance that the FDP would lose their representation, which would be significant and possibly spell the end of the party. But them being at 4%, they are within a point of that threshold. Now, for Die Linke, it's even more unlikely. The party has suffered loss after loss at state elections, the EU elections. It's pretty certain that they are going to fall below 5% and lose almost the majority of their seats. They might be able to gain a few direct mandates in Leipzig or in Berlin with candidates like Soren Pellmann or Gregor Gysi, but I would say other than a few candidates, the part, Die Linke itself is pretty much going to be dead as a political force and in federal German politics unless they are able to recover somehow. Now, one thing I want to talk about is kind of the bias of different polls. And what I've noticed over the time I followed, German politics and looked at polls, is there is an inherent bias to some of the polls. And I want to just cover those and kind of look at them. And there are various pollsters in Germany that cover the federal election, and of course certain pollsters poll different parties at different different levels. And so what I've noticed is that Allensbach is a poll that usually polls the CDU CSU very high, and we can see in this case it is an outlier. The CDU, the average of course is around 33%, and they released a poll with the CDU at 37%, and they also have the SPD at basically at a moderate support. Institute Wahlkreisprognose tends to poll the AfD significantly higher than other polls. However, in some cases, the AfD actually does better in elections than they do in polls. So sometimes this is accurate, but sometimes they do actually overstate the AfD. They do also tend to state the ruling party somewhat high. But Institute Wahlkreisprognose, they have some of their polls where they show the actual map of where each party is growing. INSA seems to be pretty much in line. There's not too much of a clear distinction. And then we have one other pollster, which is Forza. Now Forza tends to be somewhat of a left-leaning pollster in some polls. In some polls, they have the SPD and the Greens significantly higher. Not always the case, sometimes. And so there's not too much of a variation in the opinion polling. Pretty much all of it is within, the positions each party is going to get and the overall percent is not within, too much of a margin. But I just did want to cover that. Of course, that is something to take in mind when you look at the polls. And it's not necessarily meaning that these polls have an inherent political bias. It could be that their methodology is different, the types of groups of demographics they reach just make their numbers different. But it is interesting to notice, of course, that at least from what I've noticed over the years following German elections, there is kind of a difference in some of the polls. But that's, of course, not always the case. That is not a clear method. I haven't calculated them all to see what the bias or what the percentage they are off is, but that is just something I've noticed and I wanted to bring up to you. But this is why I love using the averages, because the polls together, the polling has pretty much been very accurate for most elections in Germany. There are some cases, for example, Saxony-Anhalt in 2021, where the polls were significantly off by around 10 points, and that was bad. But in most cases, the opinion polling for German elections tends to be fairly accurate. Now, of course, I will do more videos on these elections as we get closer and as we get more developments. And then tomorrow we will have the elections in Steiermark in the state of Steiermark in Austria, and I will do a video on that. And then, of course, after the federal elections, we will have Hamburg, and then after that, there won't be any more major German elections for a while. But of course, we will cover the coalition talks and other things like that. So that's going to be it. This is just an update for the next federal election. I hope you all like these videos. If you do, please like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one. Thank you for watching.